morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I know it's a busy day, holiday weekend, Jeep Fest, and all kind of things going on. So we appreciate you making Lake and Wildlife part of your morning. My name is Nara Sinclair. I'm a co-chair with Lake and Wildlife along with Brian Vassar here on the front row. So we welcome you. And just a reminder, as always, of why we exist. It's because Lake and Wildlife believes that Bentry is special, and that living here is special and comes with a responsibility to care for the natural world around us. So that's what we attempt to do here through monitoring, education, and volunteerism to do what we can to maintain this natural world, to protect it and preserve it. We don't usually present the finances. I will say that always we did a lot of that last month, so watch the video or ask Rick Patterson is our treasurer. Any questions you have about finance? And now I'm going to turn the floor over to Michael Kahn, who's our liaison to the board of directors, for an update.
We had a board meeting on August 22nd. It was rather lively as we got ready to begin the budgeting season. But a couple of the highlights, and they pertain to Lake and Wildlife. Led by our mayor, Huff, we were able to pass the no fishing policy on the spillway. So that was a big accomplishment. There was additional verbiage added to the Lake and Wildlife operating procedures, defining boat storage, decal policy, and the various fines that go with that. We also approved a memorial bench in the garden honoring Tori Ennis. Was important. There were a number of LAD consolidations. The board declined a contract with Tate Reserve that wanted to be part of the, they call it the Bentry Country Club. I didn't know we were a country club, but and we're just going to make available them, like anybody else, the ability to buy into Bentry and pay for amenities as opposed to having a contract. We approved Gerald Lambert to the AC committee. We approved an abatement on the old recycling building that has asbestos in it, and that will begin, I believe, in the next couple of weeks. And we also approved a bid from Blunt Construction to begin road paving, which will start next week. You might have seen they're staging some of their equipment up at the admin parking lot in anticipation of starting in the next week or so. There's two things that I really want to hit on. The first is the CCF, the capital contribution fee that is coming up. Please, if you have not seen the video, it was very well done by our Mr. John Hoppy over there, and presented by Ralph Morse, board member. This is very important. We have a town hall meeting also on September the 13th at 7 p.m., I believe. And ballots will go out for this CCR amendment that we will try and pass to generate additional revenue that is totally earmarked for road improvements. So we hope you will view the video, cast your ballot, whether it's yes or no, and please view the website to see John's outstanding video. And last but not least this is budget season. Please get involved, come to the meetings, send in your comments. This is your community, our community. Make sure you have an input on how you want things done. And with that, thank you very much.
Okay, a few updates from Lake and Wildlife, the subcommittees. Marietta, you have an update on Tamarack Treasures and fundraising?
We are starting our new collections in October. New day is Monday for collections. It's still from 10:30 to 11:30. New place is up at admin. Thanks to my new co-chair for fundraising, Deb White, and her team, we've been getting the basement of admin organized to keep our collections up there. And thanks to Art Tippett and his team, we've been getting the walkway down to the bottom level of admin much more accessible and safer, so we appreciate that. The things we're collecting in October, those first 4 weekends or Mondays in October, are fall and holiday items, also anything that could be given as a gift, giftables. Thank you.
Yeah, for those of you who may not know, Tamarack Treasures is just within a year and a half become the major fundraiser for Lake and Wildlife. So please support that through donations and shopping and volunteering, sharing that information. Trails. So Mason was traveling today, but he gave me these updates. You maybe have been to Sally Doss or seen Sally Doss. Upper Sally Doss was quite devastated by the storms in late July. We're tentatively planning for September 23rd for a trail cleanup day. It all depends, though, on whether BTCI is able to do some of the heavy lifting. There's still some large trees that need professionals to take them down so that it's safe in that area. So just depending on how that work evolves over the next few weeks as to whether we'll be able to then get in there and start some of the cleanup that we're able to handle and get Upper Sally Doss back in good shape. And also, I don't know if anybody's aware, but Mason and his team did put a rope handle at Denny Ridge. So if you use the Denny Ridge Trail, if you haven't been up there lately, there's now a section that's pretty steep. Some posts and some nice rope to hold on to just to help you up that one section that's pretty steep. So that was something that had been talked about for quite some time, and now it's real thanks to Mason. And the rope, I think, was not inexpensive. So that's like one of the things that fundraising has gone to pay for that rope, which can stay out there in the weather and not fray and be usable for years to come on that trail. Let's see, the stream keepers. We've talked a lot about it recently. The award-winning stream keepers and all the monitoring that we do, and there is a training that's coming up because we always like for new people to get involved. There is a certification, but you don't have to get certified to participate. So the certification is what ensures that through the Adopt a Stream program that all of the data that's entered is of a consistent quality and certain processes are followed so that it can be reliable month over month and reporting period over. But everybody that's involved doesn't have to do the certification, just the folks that enter the information and kind of guide and lead the team. So if you've ever thought about getting involved with the stream keepers, this is a great opportunity to jump in. Lori Forrester from Georgia Adopt a Stream, it comes here to Bent Tree, so our training is very local to us. It's very convenient physically. It's a great opportunity, and it's a lot of fun to get involved and just come and learn how the sampling is done and what's all involved. And that's going to be in October. That's a Saturday, Sunday, 28th and 29th. It's usually like 3/4 of the day on Saturday and then a Sunday afternoon. All right, so if you've ever wanted to get involved, that's a good opportunity. Our next meeting will be our October meeting will be the Habitat Conservation Group laying out our plan. We changed the name from Forest Conservation to Habitat Conservation, recognizing that that's a broader term and it goes beyond our woodland and our forest. So a lot of good stuff going on, a lot of good plans and opportunities, so plan on that. All right, I am going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to introduce our main presentation for the day.
Good morning. I met Keith Ray when I was up at the Adopt a Stream Confluence in March, where we won our award for data input and so on for our Stream Keepers group, which I work with. And subsequently, the North Etowah Alliance group, which is another group in Canton, invited us to come down to receive an award and also to listen to Keith speak. And so I got to see Keith speak about the area and about the Etowah area, and I thought, boy, this would be really great for our group. And so Keith was nice enough to come to speak to us today, but I just want to give you a little bit of background on Keith. He's the Director of Conservation for the Southeastern Trust for Parks and Land, and he will explain that when he comes up. It's a very interesting group. He comes to us with 15 years of experience in biology, with the focus on conservation and ecology in the southeastern ecosystems. He attended Auburn, and that's okay, I guess, where he received a master's in biology. He's a fish biologist at heart. He spent his entire career focused on biodiversity and historical influences that factor into the species and are found in our area. He has had several publications and described and found some new species of fish. He's done research around the world, including the Republic of the Congo, Brazil, and more than 20 states here in the United States. He's been in projects in Canada, Venezuela, Colombia, and even more. Quite the globalist. Many projects which have dealt with endangered species and other impacts that they may have and rare finds of mammals. Most recently, he was a biology professor at the University at Reinhardt, and he taught introductory classes in biology and geographic information systems, field biology, and biology education. He's a grant writer. Keith has received and written positive grants for over $700,000, including almost $650,000 from the National Scientific Foundation. He's been a board member and works for the Southeastern Trust for Parks and Land, and has volunteered his time all over the area. He loves to hike and camp. Most importantly, his wife and 3 sons live right here in Jasper. How about a warm welcome for Keith?
Good morning. Thank you for having me this morning. I'm excited to be here, and Brian, thank you for inviting me. I know a couple of people in the room, and you guys probably know I never turn down the chance to talk about what I'm very passionate about for my career. So yeah, my name is Keith. I am from Jasper. Actually, I grew up in the Yellow Creek area, so I'm not far from my home roots, and my family still lives there. So I know you guys know where Gibbs Garden is. We own a big tract of land right next to Gibbs Garden. So I grew up in the heart of the Etowah River Basin, and growing up, I had absolutely no clue what was going on around me, underwater anyway. I knew what was going on in the woods. You couldn't pull me out of the woods. But and I will tell you, I told some people this morning, I used to come up here and stomp around in Bent Tree when I was a lot younger. It's been almost 20 years since I've been back up here, so the invite was more than welcome. But I was causing a little trouble the last time I was up here. So if you ever want a good story about what not to do in certain situations in life, ask me my Bent Tree story. So I put up a slide. I didn't know Brian was going to give me such a wonderful introduction, but so yeah, I graduated from Reinhardt University with a bachelor's in bio, and then I went to Auburn. I was at Auburn a long time, and War Eagle, to those of you who got me earlier. And if you're uncomfortable with that, you know, it's okay if you leave. But I was there for a long time. I actually did my master's, and I started on my PhD. I actually quit my PhD after 5 years, and I actually have enough credits from Auburn for 2 PhDs. That's how long I was at Auburn. But they told me I needed 2 more years of work, and I was like, I've got 2 little kids. Let's go see what else is going on in life. So I'm not upset by that decision at all. I think it's a very important story for particularly young people to hear, that you can change your mind anytime you want to. But as you guys can see, I get into all kinds of stuff. With my current position, I do wildland firefighting. We do prescribed fires on a lot of our properties for management and control of things. I am an aquatic biologist at heart. My wife says I belong in the water, and anytime there's water, my children will find it, and I will quickly follow or lead them myself. But yes, as Brian said, my training is in taxonomy and systematics. So that is the naming and understanding the relationships between species and how we get all of the biodiversity that we see across the planet. And I've done a lot of work in South America and in North America. And the Southeast is home. The Southeast is where my heart got drawn back to. And so learning why has always been something that kind of clicked in my head. A lot of people know that we have a lot of biodiversity here in the Southeast. A lot of folks don't understand why that biodiversity exists. And it's an amazing story when we start putting the puzzle pieces together. And I hope you actually see some of the puzzle pieces today, because the first time I saw them, a light bulb went off. And I said, it is a puzzle. And I get to go figure out that puzzle. And it's very exciting to me. So, I'll give you a quick background about what it is I actually do now. After my academic career, I've been working for the Southeastern Trust for Parks and Land for about a year and a half now as the Director of Conservation. And so my job is the environmental stewardship on over 10,000 acres of conserved properties throughout the Southeast. So we are spread over 3 different states, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia. And these are our property locations across those states. So my job is to visit those properties, understand and evaluate what's going on environmentally, what issues do we have, what kinds of things can we do to improve the environment there on our properties, and implement those policies. And we have 3 main pillars to our mission. We have conservation, recreation, and community. And so some of you may be familiar with some of our parks. We have the Talking Rock Nature Park. Does anybody know where that's at? It's the mountain bike mixed-use park near Biggins on 515. That's a 215-acre park with almost 14 miles of trails. They're impervious, or they're pervious surfaces, low impact to the environment. And so when you show up on our parks, a lot of people think playgrounds and fields for picnics and things like that. That's not the kind of parks that we have. Our nature parks are get people out, natural surface trails, and let the environment do what it's going to do around you. And we're part of the environment as we go in there. So that's our conservation and recreation. And then building community health and involvement. That is key to how we succeed where we build our parks. So we have community gardens, we have seminars, we have apiaries, they have beekeeping classes on certain parks. We build recreational training facilities for youth mountain biker groups in inner city Atlanta and places like that. We also have bouldering parks. So currently we have 13 publicly accessible parks. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, considering that 24 months ago, just before I started, we had 1. And so our founder's vision has started coming to life, and we have been building parks at a breakneck speed across the Southeast. And a lot of exciting programs coming up. I'm actually in talks with the Nature Conservancy and the DNR of taking ownership of over 6,000 acres of floodplain in South Georgia to help protect the Satilla River and the Brunswick corridor down there. So we have a lot of big projects that we're working on. And if you guys want to know more about it, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. But I think you guys are actually here to see stuff like this. And this picture by a gentleman who was gracious enough. This is an image taken by Isaac Szabo, who is a fish and aquatic photographer, and absolutely fell in love with his work. So you'll see a few of the pictures that he's graciously allowed me to use. But these are rainbow shiners. Have you guys ever seen some of the rainbow shiners? Do you guys even know what rainbow shiners are? Okay. I'm going to tell you a secret. They're all around you. These are actually from probably near the Georgia-Alabama border. I don't think Isaac has been up here taking photographs. I can take you today and find these fish, but they don't look like this. So rainbow shiners are one of the groups of fish that change color when they're spawning. When it's time for them to make babies, they just brighten up and go ballistic. And they have these spawning aggregations. And then you will probably see in different places, different images, they're associate spawners. They're nest associates. Another fish, like a creek chub or a river chub, will build a nest, and then these guys will spawn in that nest with 4 or 5 other species of fish all at one time. And the nest builders are prolific alterers of the aquatic environment. And my family finally got to see one of these for the first time ever in the Etowah River. It was not a rainbow shiner nest, it was a different type of shiner, but the same family of shiners. And they just glow. They're bright colors. And in the springtime when this happens, it's absolutely fascinating. But growing up, I did not know this existed on my family's farm. And so when I got to college, I had an introduction to catching fish in the creek at Reinhardt University by a professor named Dr. Steve Powers, still a very good friend of mine. He was my mentor. And I remember jumping in the stream with him one day for the first time ever, and he had a net, and I thought, this guy's crazy. There's nothing in this little creek. And in that single day, we pulled out 20 species of fish with very, very little effort. And I thought, why are these here? Like, how did I not know about all of this cool stuff going on in the stream? And so this picture just kind of illustrates that for me. You know, we have these here. People just don't know about them. So the question becomes, though, why are they like this? Why do we have so much cool stuff? So biodiversity, you guys probably know what biodiversity is. When we talk about it, it's just simply a way to measure how many different types of living things there are around us. And that's all the way from the tiniest of bacteria to the biggest of things that we can't move, right? Big trees and large mammals and things like that, and everything in between. And the Southeast is simply one of the most biodiverse areas on the planet. Like, bar none, outside of the tropics, you will not find anywhere else in the planet that has more types of living organisms than we have here in the Southeast. So we really do, I love the words, the treasure that you guys have here. You live in a treasure trove of biodiversity. Absolutely amazing stuff. So I put a small emblem on this map, and that's where we are. I don't know, can you guys see the little emblem, the circle there? So that's where Bent Tree is. You guys are in the northern portion of Pickens County, and the blue line that you're just above, that's the Etowah River. And the dashed white line that makes a circle, that's going to be the Etowah River Basin. So you guys are, every bit of the water that you have here goes down into the Etowah River, makes its way over to Rome, Georgia, where the Coosa River forms, and then goes through the state of Alabama through a series of rivers, the Coosa, the Alabama, and then down into the Mobile and Tensas Delta and dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. Makes a heck of a journey, right? I've played in most of the water most of the way from here to there. And when we take a look, this is in the heart of one of the most biodiverse areas on the planet. And as we start getting into some of the accolades of the river itself, you'll see that the numbers are pretty impressive. So it's a relatively small river basin. We do have Lake Altoona that's in the middle. It's dammed. That plays a part in what we do and don't see here, as well as all the dams down the Coosa all the way down into the state of Alabama. They cause issues for a lot of aquatic organisms. As you'll see, we're missing a few that we should have. And the biggest thing for the Etowah River Basin, it's centered in one of the fastest growing places in the nation. And you guys can look inside the gates of Bent Tree and tell that this is a very fast growing area. So let's take a look, and I'll introduce you guys to some of the fish in the Etowah. And I'll say some of the fish because we can't go over them all. In the Etowah, there's about 120 species of fish. And some of you may go, well, why don't you know exactly how many species of fish there are? Well, we're still actually figuring out that there's undescribed species of fish even within the Etowah River Basin. You guys may have read in the Pickens Progress back in the springtime, there were some folks here from the Tennessee Aquarium that were sampling fish at Cove Road where it crosses Long Swamp just below town. They know there's a new species of fish that exists within the Long Swamp Creek Basin in the upper Etowah. It's just not been described scientifically yet. So they're there catching it, getting the evidence to build for their case of why that needs to be a new species. So we're still learning. There's 3 or 4 endemics. And an endemic means that it's only found here in the Etowah Basin. There's nowhere else in the world you can go to find it. You can't go outside of this basin and find it. It's only found here. And The fourth one, it says 3 or 4. The fourth one that they were looking for in the spring is probably a fourth one. There probably are about 5 or 6 if we really take a hard look. But the 3 that we do have that are endemic are the Cherokee darter, the Etowah darter, and the amber darter. They're only found up here in the Etowah River Basin. And all 3 of those are federally protected. So they're only found here. They're at risk of going extinct or becoming endangered. So they're all 3 carry heavy federal protections so that we hopefully don't run out of them. And then there's at least 3 fish that are no longer found here. And that would be the American eel, the Alabama sturgeon, and the Alabama shad. They require long river migrations. And we can't get fish to migrate when we put dams in the way. So really big run-of-the-river dams like we have at Lake Altoona, Lake Weiss, those fish cannot make it here. Even with fish ladders, they can't make it here for the most part. Just so you guys know, if you ever get asked, only salmon and trout like fish ladders. Nothing else really likes a fish ladder. But some of my favorite species that we have here, there's the bronze darter. These are all really common. There's the Alabama shiner and the creek chub. Notice that Alabama shiner, that's a large breeding male. Females do not look like that. So in the animal world, particularly fish and aquatic organisms, if you see the organism change when it's time to spawn, it's usually the males that change. It's energy expensive for the females to do it. So the males are going to change color. It's also a really high risk, right? So if you're a bright colored fish all of a sudden one day, because you're saying, hey, look at me, I'm sexy, you want to come swim with me? That's a risk because the bird on the bank is going, oh wow, look at that little red fish swimming by, and it's going to ping you really quickly. So it's an associated risk. The knobs on his head look really weird, and they only get those during their breeding season, their spawning season. Those are called tubercles, and you can actually determine what species they are sometimes by the patterns of the tubercles on their heads. Just you give me a snapshot of the tubercles, I'll look it up and tell you what species you got. That's all I need. But those are actually there for fighting. And once spawning season is over, they fall off. And they're actually external teeth that grow from their skin surface. It's a really cool characteristic that a lot of our minnows have. See, the minnow world is weird, right? The minnow world is really weird. The creek chub down there, if you look, he has them too. So the creek chub is a different species of minnow, and their patterns are the same, indicative. Notice he is carrying a really large rock for himself. He is a rock mover, and they love to build nests when it's their spawning season, and then the rest of the time they spend their lives flipping rocks and eating bugs from underneath them. So really cool stuff that goes on. When we take a look, more fish that we see a lot of these things. Tricolor shiners are one of the most common things. The mobile log perch is one of my most favorite things. Looks like a tiger underwater, and actually when you don't take a picture of it underwater, when you are looking at it, they will disappear. They are so, you look at that and you're like, well, that kind of stands out. No, that is a near perfect aquatic camouflage. You can be staring right at them and they're sitting on the surface of a rock in bright sunshine, you'll never see it. So, and then we got things like red breast sunfish, very common in our waters. Not the bluegill. The bluegill are common, but more in the slow parts of the rivers where they've been introduced for the most part. So bluegill may or may not be native to the Etowah, but that's not easily determined right this second. We can't pick out which ones are introduced and which ones are native. So, but red breast sunfish, they get really big. Beautiful, people love to look at them. But this is not normally the view that you get of fish, is it? Normally it's that streak that runs by you. I'm going to go back. No, I'm not going to go forward. So when we take a look at something like the tricolor shiner, it's found in the rest of the Coosa Basin as well, down to about central Alabama. It's found up here. When you get down to the Tallapoosa River, there's a fish that looks exactly like that one. But it is not the same species. It's actually called the Tallapoosa shiner. And as you guys will see in a minute, they've been split up from one another. And so they have diverged through time. And they have become their own species. They're morphologically different, they're genetically different, so they're not the same thing, but they look, to the untrained eye, identical. As a matter of fact, it would take me a while. If you plop two in a jar in front of me, I would say, I don't know. I had to go get my book. So, when I say that we're going to talk about different species and the mechanisms, that's the kind of thing that I'm starting to talk about. It's not easy for an untrained eye to catch some of these things, but when you look at it on a map, that's when you get the keys to what we're doing. And so more of my talk is less about the species themselves. And if you want to learn about all kinds of fish, I will happily teach you about all kinds of fish. But even for 120 species, I've not touched all 120 species in the Etowah River. Some are really hard to see. Some you'll never see. But what I want to talk to you guys about today is how we actually get to this point of having so much. And so that when I tell people about how we get this, there's four main ingredients that you need to get a lot of biodiversity. And so the first one of those is you need a geologically stable time period. A long time period. The second thing you need is a lot of water and lots of fresh water. The other things that you need are some variability. So let's think about the Etowah River Basin and the world around you guys. What are we in right now, geologically speaking? You're sitting on the side of one. Mountains. There's mountains, right? So that mountain over there is taller than this mountain over here, right? There's sharp ones, there's round ones, there's deep valleys. But what if you go towards Canton? Do we have mountains in Canton? No. What is it? It's rolling hills, right? And there's a lot of places, like if you go to downtown Canton, where the parks are, there's large floodplains that are flat. If you go to Rome, do you have mountains? No. There's deep U-shaped valleys and hard-topped ridges. The rocks aren't even the same. That is what we mean by geographic or geologic variability. Okay, so it's stable, but it's not the same all the way through. So the Etowah goes through a lot of geologically different places. And then the other thing is I call it the Goldilocks effect, right? It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right most of the year in this region. And so we get just enough energy, but the fish and the organisms have to have the adaptations to survive the winter as well. So we get hot, we get cold, but we're not as hot as the tropics, and we're not as cold as any further north. So it's just right. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about here. So I'm a very visual map guy. And the red area is the Etowah Basin. And for those who don't know, you are right there in the bend of that Etowah Basin. And what I want to show you is just a series of lines. But then we're going to put the lines together to see how those puzzle pieces fit together. So the first thing I want to show you, and we're going to talk about geologic stability. We lie at the southern end of the Appalachian Mountains, and the southern Appalachians are old. Do you guys know how old the Appalachians are? Billions of years. There's been four recorded mountain building, what they call orogenies, in the eastern U.S. So the Appalachians have actually risen 4 different times, and all 4 times they were probably as high as the Rockies are now. That's a lot, right? So we're talking about a long period of time. But in that time period, oceans come up, oceans go down. This is not something new that we see. And you guys drive by it all the time if you go to Jasper. There's marble, right? Marble is sediment that was at the bottom of the ocean. Now it's on top of a mountain. Yeah, if you go look at the marble mines, you can actually go through and fleck out tiny marine fossils. You won't find any vertebrates that's that old, but there's tiny marine fossils in there. So what we see at the top of a mountain now used to be the bottom of the ocean. So how do we know it's changed? Well, there's some pretty good evidence right there. So what I mean by geologically stable is that we're going to talk about oceans and we're going to talk about glaciers. They're big drivers in the geology of North America. We haven't been underwater here, and we haven't been under glaciers here for almost 300 million years. So that's a long, long time. So our first key ingredient is geologic stability. So we haven't been interrupted by any major forces, no volcanoes, nothing that's wiping off the surface of the land ever so often. That's a big, important key factor for biodiversity. If you go to Hawaii, there's nowhere near as much biodiversity, and they keep blowing up with volcanoes every few years, right? So the land is wiped clean. So when we take a look at this, the other thing you got to have is a lot of water. And most people don't know this. You guys are actually sitting on the edge of a rainforest. So the southern Appalachians in some years gets way more rain than the Pacific Northwest. And in the last 3 years, we've probably gotten way more rain than the Pacific Northwest in most areas outside of the Olympic Peninsula. So you guys live on the edge of a temperate rainforest. So there's two of our key ingredients. We have a long, stable geologic time period, and we have a lot of water here. So some years in the southern Smokies, the southern Appalachians, we'll get, on average, it says we get 60 to 80 inches of rain a year here. That's a lot of rain. In some years, we get over 100, and that's full rainforest. So we live on the edge of a temperate rainforest, so water's not an issue. If you got a lot of water and you got a lot of time, that means that we're going to have a lot of opportunity for biodiversity to happen. So let's take a look. The other thing, people laugh. This took me 15 years to put together. 2 lines on a map took me 15 years, and I accidentally found the data on a National Institute of Health webpage. Way to go, right? Hide the data from us. But if we look at this upper line, no, the pointer doesn't show up there. The upper line up there, I'll take this with me. This represents the southernmost point that glaciers made it to that we actually know about. There's some evidence they made a little bit further south towards Roanoke, Virginia. But for the most part, we know that the glaciers within the last couple 100,000 years made it collectively as far south as that line. But when there's that much water locked up, and we're talking about glaciers that are 1 to 2 miles thick, when there's that much ice locked up on the planet, the oceans go down. So this line down here represents the ancient coastal pathways, edges, the ancient seashore. So we know that the coast, we can look at actual underwater maps, and you can see all the rivers that run, like the Mississippi, the Mobile Delta, the Chattahoochee, the Apalachicola Basin. We know that those rivers actually carved canyons all the way out to that edge where they reach the ancient ocean. And those canyons are still there. So if you guys like to go deep sea fishing off the coast of Panama and Destin, you're going to go off and you're going to go down to those where those deep sea canyons are 10, 15 miles out. You're catching fish in an ancient river canyon that used to flow down to the ocean right there. Isn't that pretty crazy? So we know that these things, the evidence is there for them. Keep that glacial point in mind, okay? And so all these rivers actually used to go down there and connect. So the coastal rivers we have now that don't connect, they actually used to connect further down onto the continental shelf. All right. But then when glaciers melt, water moves. And the last time that we saw the ocean come up, North America was actually bouncing because the glaciers were melting. So North America bobbles like a bobber, right? And if you've ever been to physical therapy and you got to stand on one of those balance ball things, North America is doing that, okay? It's still recovering from the glaciers moving. And that line is the last time the sea incursion occurred, that was the line that it occurred on, and that's what we know now as the coastal plain line. That's the fall line. So places like Augusta, Macon, Auburn, Alabama, Birmingham, all are on that fall line. And that's a big driver because we know the oceans came up that far and made a coastline. So we put all that together. The glacial line comes down, the oceans go up, and we're left with 2 big circles on our eastern U.S. map. And those are the unglaciated areas of eastern North America. And they're very important to our discussion because they haven't been underwater and they haven't been under ice in almost 300 million years. That's big. That's really big. And the other thing that they have is mountains. They all have mountains inside of them. So if we look over to the west, we have the Ozarks in the upper half of that, and the Ouachitas in the southern half of that. And then over here we have the southern Appalachians, and then the Ridge and Valley. And all of its folds from when Africa kept beating up North America a couple of billion years ago, right? So things got shook up, luckily not while we were around to see it. But these are two regions of incredibly stable geology time periods. And that's the key point here, okay? And what's cool is what happens between them. So what is actually happening here, what happened here, was that these regions in these red circles became refugia. So if you're a freshwater fish and the ocean is coming up, you're going to try to move through time upwards, right? You're going to try to get away from that. So these species as a group, just groups, they were trying to get away from all that, because if you're a freshwater fish, you don't like salt water. The other thing is that the freshwater fish and the plant species and everything else that was in the north, as the glaciers come down, are driven down. And the other fortunate thing is orientation. How many of you guys have been to the Alps? Anybody been to the Alps? It's a beautiful place, right? I flew over them one time on my way to Africa. The Alps lie east to west, right? So when the glaciers came down in Europe, there were these really tall mountains that also had glaciers, and the biodiversity got squished in between them. And guess what happened to most of the biodiversity in Europe? It went away. So Europe in the last ice ages lost most of its biodiversity. Most of it went away because it had nowhere to go. But here in North America, we had north-south oriented mountain ranges. So the biodiversity didn't get squished, it just kept going until it stopped. And then as the glaciers retreated, it repopulated going north. So once all this clears up, here's what we start to see. The red means a whole lot of biodiversity, okay? So this is an indice, and this is aquatic groups, aquatic organisms, not just fish, but there's mussels, fish, and crayfish over there on the right-hand side. This is all of it put together. And so what happens is from these refugia, from those safe places where the biodiversity was just sitting in existence while these big geologic things are going on, once it was safe for those organisms to expand out, they did. And if you look, some of the most biodiverse places are the areas between those two red circles. So the eastern or the western side of the Tennessee River Basin is probably the most temperate biodiversity we see in any kind of aquatic ecosystem on the planet. There are dozens and dozens of species of mussel, dozens of species of crayfish there, and almost every creek has a unique species of fish that's similar to the one in the creek over, but they're different species because they've been isolated from each other for quite a while now. And so this creek over here doesn't go in the mountains, it comes from the meadows and the edges of the prairie land and things like that. And this one's over here in the creeks, and these fish can't swim up and down these areas because there's waterfalls in the way, and there's other barriers in the way that you and I might not think are barriers, but to the fish we can clearly see that they're barriers. So once they get deposited somewhere, the geology is stable, they stay there. And we get to see this isolation of these groups, and that is what develops into new species. So why do we have so many species? Because we have a lot of variety going on in our geology, and it's been really stable for a long time. They're isolated from each other. And so, let me flip back. So this is just the aquatic organisms. If we had days and days of time, I would pull out books and books of maps after map after map, and we could lay it over those geology maps that I showed you, and they would fit like exact puzzle pieces, one right after another. And when you start putting those puzzle pieces together, you start realizing that this was a really important set of factors that's driving why we see what we see. So when you look out and you see all the really cool trees, you know, everybody likes the Smoky Mountains. All the accolades go to the Smoky Mountains, and they're an amazing place. You know, in the Smoky Mountains, there are about 120, 130 species of trees. That's more than the entirety of the continent of Europe put together. Yeah. And we have trees here that in other parts of the world are in much higher latitudes further north because the glaciers drove them south, and in the southern Appalachians they had a place that was a safe harbor for them as a species through time. So we can do this with insects. The maps are a little fuzzier with things that move a lot, like certain animals, big animals. Deer are everywhere, right? Yeah, deer don't care if there's a waterfall in the way. For the most part, you guys probably have learned that bear really don't care if your porch is in the way. They're gonna climb over whatever they want to. So these maps become fuzzier the more mobile the organism. But when things can't move around a lot, when they can't fly around, when they can't run or climb over mountains that are in the way, these patterns are like very detailed puzzle pieces, and it's amazing how well they fit together. It's absolutely fascinating. And so this is what drew me to wanting to understand biodiversity. And once I started to see these patterns here, my job became at Auburn to look at those patterns globally. And so part of my training was to literally sit and look at maps and go, right there is a place where we should see a new species, different from everything else, because we found one other species of a different type of critter there. I think the fishers follow in the same pattern if we take a look at the maps. And so that's how I became trained to find new species and have a starting point was, what do the maps look like? What does that puzzle piece look like? And can we cut the map into a puzzle piece? And then go see if we can do it. And see if those ideas match what we actually see in the natural world. So these are really powerful concepts when we talk about biology and biodiversity, conservation. How do we know that we need to save something in one particular place? We start looking at the maps, and we start seeing where the most important places are to start saving. And that's actually where this set of maps comes from. These are heat maps to help drive our money and our focus on where biodiversity needs the most help. So where's the most of it? Where do we get the most bang for our buck? Okay, we can save a lot more species if we focus in the red and do really big conservation projects. All right, so I'll show you guys a couple more things, and this will finish up my talk, just to give you an illustration of what I mean by how can we tell where the fish are moving and how these puzzle pieces are fitting together. Are there puzzle pieces still in existence that we're starting to understand? And the answer is yes to that. But it's even on a smaller scale than you guys might imagine. And so these are two of the species that we have. Have you guys heard of the Etowah darter and the Cherokee darter that we have here? One of the largest populations of the Etowah darter, a federally endangered species, is actually here in Long Swamp Creek. I've helped do that monitoring for several different monitoring periods since I was in college. And probably one of the largest populations of Etowah darters exists behind Pickens County High School. So where Cove Road crosses Long Swamp Creek below town, from there till 53 at Tate, just below the Tate Mansion, is probably one of the most important habitat stretches for the Etowah darter. And you can find dozens of them in there. And it's really fun to go find them. They're beautiful fish, as you can tell.
How big are these that we're looking at?
About that long. Well, the Etowah darter gets about that long,
okay.
About 3 inches. Cherokee darters, they're about 2 inches. And so Cherokee darter, they are a threatened species. They're way more common than the Etowah darter. If you go look for an Etowah darter, you're going to spend some time looking for an Etowah darter, unless you know really well how to look. We can go down and pretty easily catch maybe 5, 10 in an hour. On a really, really good day, we'll catch 10 in an hour. 5's pretty easy to come up with. That's a lot of effort if you are asking about the fish world. For some of these species, I can catch 5,000 in 30 minutes, 15 minutes, so there's not a lot of them. They're just naturally rare in their environment. Cherokee darters are they're important, but when you go find them, they're like rats in the stream. You can catch 1,000 in 15 minutes, but that may be the only species you catch in that tiny stretch of stream. So when they're there and the environment's good and they're not impacted through pollution or runoff or development, they're really common in their environment. But they're super tiny, and they also live in the stream with about 4 other darters that look a lot like them. So you sit there and go, I don't know. What was that characteristic we're looking for? Oh yes, that one. Yeah, okay, that one's got it. Or hey, pull out the little hand lens on the microscope thing and let's take a view and see if it's got this little piece and part on it. So, but these things are fantastic little organisms. They're beautiful. I got to catch some breeding male Cherokee darters a couple of springs ago with the DNR and take some photographs, and they're absolutely wonderful organisms to catch, little fish to catch. But let's take a look at the Cherokee darter for a second. So the Cherokee darter is only found in the Etowah River Basin and nowhere else. And you would think, okay, if I say to you, the Cherokee darter is a very unique species, right? And you think, anywhere I find a Cherokee darter, it's going to be the same as every other Cherokee darter. No. Those geologic barriers are present today, and we're seeing how they're affecting those species today. So this is the Etowah River Basin. This comes from a study from a master's or PhD student at UGA. All those black dots, ignore the circles for a second if you can. Those black dots are where they caught the fish. That's where we know Cherokee darters exist. They exist in a lot more places, but that's where they went for their study to capture them and take their DNA. Okay, so these are genetics. These are based off genetic studies, and what we see is that down where the green circles are, that's one related group of fish. These are all Cherokee darters, but they are genetically different from all the ones in the yellow circle. And those are genetically different from all the ones in the red circle. So they're identifiable already by their subpopulations. So what does that mean? We're watching the formation of new species as we speak. Are they new species yet? Great question. I haven't taken the time to try to answer that. But could they be on their way? Most definitely. And we're already seeing that structure. And what are those structures? What are geologically happening? If you look in the upper Etowah Basin, then there's a big set of falls up there. You go down a little bit further, what do you hit? Lake Altoona. And there was a big set of falls right there. So these fish are finding ways of connecting to each other inside those circles, but the circles are not connecting with each other. Isn't that pretty crazy? So they're starting to become more isolated again through a different set of processes. And this is happening all over the globe, all the time, with every group of organisms that you see. This is pretty much starting to happen aquatically. And it's a great thing, and we're getting to watch this process. But when it comes time for conservation, how do we protect these unique things that are happening before we lose them? And that's where my job comes in. But I'll go ahead and finish up. Like I said, the biodiversity here in the Southeast is driven by 4 major factors when we talk about aquatic biodiversity. But terrestrial biodiversity is not immune to those same 4 factors. It's driven by them as well, but in different ways. And the Etowah is a species generator. As you guys can see in that last one, we've got a species that looks to be speciating again, and may in the future, and it may not. So those could find a way to come back together, and we don't have any of those barriers. But it's part of a much larger complex of biodiversity happening in the Southeast, and has been happening for a long, long time. And that's why it's such a special place. And those things are going to continue to happen until they're impacted. And so that's what I hope my talk has showed you today, and I encourage you to get out there and explore. And if you find something cool, document it. We all have cell phones now. You never know when your discovery or your picture might make a huge difference in the world of a researcher's life that's finding out new things about these things. So, yes, ma'am.
What factors go into deciding, yes, this is a new species? I know it's a process, but...
A lot of time, a lot of alcohol. A lot of training. So when we take a look, and by the way, none of those are a joke, because that was the average length of time to describe a new species and recognize it as new nowadays is for any organism group is on the order of 10 years. Right now, I mean, I have a notebook at home, and I could probably whip that notebook out, and if somebody gave me $1 million, in 2 years I'd have 30 new species described. We know about them. We just don't have the money or the time, and there's not enough people trained. And so what makes that, it depends on the species that you're looking at, what kind of organism it is. So is it a fungus? Is it a bacteria? Is it fish? Different organisms speciate at different rates due to different impacts from their environment. You can look at them genetically, physiologically, morphologically, so what their bodies look like, and then geologically, so geographically, where are they found versus other things. And it's a comprehensive picture that you have to draw to describe those now. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot of evidence. Like for my master's degree, I described one new species in my master's. It took 10 years. I went to 6 or 7 different museums around the world to view specimens of those in jars on a shelf, and thousands of live pictures. And I measured and counted things on thousands of those fish and databased it. And I'll be honest with you, after almost 5 years, it clicked one night. Like that's, I was in the Field Museum in Chicago and really hungover. That's why I say it takes a lot of alcohol. And I picked up a jar. I picked up a jar with a fish in it, and it clicked. And I said, "You don't look anything like those other ones." And it turns out I had seen the species already. I just didn't know enough to recognize it. Mm-hmm. And so my boss used to say, yeah, describing species is very scientific, but there's an art to it. And you have to spend so much time with them that you just see it when you see it.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
You talk about catching them. How are you catching those little things?
A lot of different ways. We use big nets, seines. We use, in certain environments where the water's swift or it's really difficult, there's a lot of rocks and logs in the water, we'll actually use a backpack electroshocker. We'll send a little electrical current which stuns the fish. And if you've ever been electrocuted, you twitch, right? And so when you send electrical current through the water, they twitch. And it usually makes them twitch just enough, they pop out of their hiding places, and you can scoop them up. I know it's not fun to be electrocuted by those units. It looks like a big Ghostbuster backpack that you carry around. It's just a computer with a battery on it. and you carry the switch in your hand. Yes, sir.
How do you differentiate between, say, an endangered species and one that's going extinct? Where is there one of the same?
They're kind of one and the same. It's a semantical argument. It's a subjective thing. Depends on what you can show. Sometimes we don't even know enough about them to show anything. And sometimes we don't know enough about them, that's why they're endangered. We know we can't find them. We know that there are enough about them that we know that they're being impacted, but we really don't have an idea about how many there are. So it's a tough question to answer. Really depends on the species, yes.
This is probably very controversial. You hear so much about it, truth or lies. Is the climate control or change affecting your species or water quality? Oh, of course. Yes. It's
one of the interesting things that has been modeled and studied that I've seen is, I don't have a picture of them. I'm making sure I've got all the words in my head first of the names. I don't want to get the wrong thing. So it's these little fish that are sculpin, okay? And we have them around here. They're very common fish. A study came out several years ago that discovered that sculpin barely move their entire lives. So you may go to a stream and catch 100 sculpin. They discovered that the average sculpin doesn't move more than 33 feet from where it was born its entire life. It can have hundreds of miles of stream uninterrupted. It won't move outside of about a 33-foot span of stream. Where that comes into play is if they said, okay, well, if that's the case, sculpin are very temperature-sensitive organisms in their environment. So if the water gets too hot or too cold, they don't like it. If it gets too hot, they die really easy. So they started modeling what was going to have to happen with sculpin if the water temperatures start going up. And the water temperatures have started going up like their model showed. And they basically showed that if the sculpin don't start moving like 40 feet, then the ones at lower elevations will start disappearing. And so there are folks watching that now and saying, okay, the water temperature changed this year. You know, it's a degree warmer than it was on average last year. Where'd the sculpin go? And so there have been mark recapture studies. They're starting to study things like that. So the worry is, you know, a lot of the organisms can adapt in a way to climate change. It's the pace that we worry about it. Yes?
Another thing is, you don't see it too much here, but a lot of parts of the United States are facing severe water drought conditions. How does that impact your fish population? I mean,
it greatly impacts it. As a matter of fact, the whole reason I stayed for my PhD was because, well, it was 2008, and the economy went to, you know what. But the other interesting thing was that there was drought. And for my PhD, I was studying what was considered a cold water species. Everybody thought these things had to exist in really cold water, spring-fed creeks and streams. And in between 2008 and 2010, there was an insane drought here in the southeastern United States. And I showed that they could live in almost boiling water. You know, like for fish, the streams dried up and the fish went down all the way to the tiniest little pockets. So they have ways of surviving. And those with drought and things like that, the populations are going to flux and change. But when you start talking about places like the lower Colorado where the entire river goes dry, that's a bad thing. And they've lost a lot of things out there that they may never know that they've lost now. Yes, ma'am.
Are you finding any changes with the fish with the introduction of the microplastics in the water?
I've not looked at that, but what people have started doing is going back to those museum specimens that I mentioned, because museum specimens are just dead things in jars on the shelf. They're a library through time. And so people have started going back and looking at those museum specimens' gut contents for the last century, and they can pretty much tell you when plastics were introduced in mass consumption in North America. It's like day one plastic in the gut. They can go, because we know when the dates that they were collected. We know the average ages of most of these fish. At least we know enough about most of the species they're looking at, and it was like day one, there's plastic in the gut now that they can determine and detect those things. Yep. Yes?
Are there efforts to encourage people to buy land and set up conservation easements or trusts?
Sure, yes.
Yes, for sure. And that's what I do a lot of now. And so we hold easements on only a select few lands that we've agreed to. But for the most part, we own all of our own properties, but they're put under deed restriction. And then, but yeah, there are really good tax incentives right now. There's really good tax incentives for that now. And the other thing is that we're also waiting for some for some legal issues to be resolved through the courts to see how that was going to continue. Some people took grand advantage of that and kind of abused it. So we're waiting for that to start up again. But yeah, the want is still there. And then other organizations, they're a little bit different from mine. They have funding for purchasing land and protecting the land, where those transactions can take place much quicker, much faster, much more durably than if government was involved. And so, yeah, there's a lot of effort right now to save a lot of the lands that are undeveloped. And we're really starting to target lands that have impact with, flooding in particular. We've been in discussions with the PD Indian tribe recently to help them, assist them in obtaining some lands on the PD River where their communities have been flooded out due to logging. And so we're working with different organizations to address things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of incentive for conserving land right now, financial incentive through tax benefits and things like that. But real estate boom right this second has caught people's attention as well. So the land is oftentimes more valuable money-wise, and as a value asset, it's a stronger pull to sell that for development than it is to conserve it. Yes.
One thing that bothers me, and I've seen it in wastewater, but it's finally getting into our drinking water streams. So it's been out for quite a while. It's antibiotics. They're starting to show up, and now they're even talking fentanyl that's starting to show up in wastewater streams now. Would that be a concern over time? Affect the fish population?
One of the biggest impactors on aquatic organisms, birth control pills. There's such an excess volume of estrogen in the water that some amphibian species they're detecting now are not changing sex as larvae.
So they end up being sterile?
No, they all end up being female. It's a great question. I don't know enough about that. I do know that there have been documented impacts of estrogen on particularly amphibians, and we know that there's likely an impact from fish on fish as well from those types of things. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What about working with developers to change their practices so that even though they're developing, they're not causing as much damage?
So that's been a big thing that we've been discussing, particularly my organization. We actually tried to work with a couple of developers in DeKalb County where they wanted to build homes on a set of lots for, I'm just going to say 40 people, like 40 homes. And we said, well, you can get the same housing density. We worked in negotiations with them and another group that came to us and said, hey, if we can work this out, would you take the excess land that we whittled down from their development to help protect it as a park around the development, as a buffer zone? And we said, that would be fantastic if you can get it to work out. So they were going to build a lot of single-family homes on this large tract of land. The other organization said, hey, you can make the same amount of money if you build the density closer and then leave a park buffer around your homes. Your home values would probably be higher in the long run because of the public space, the open space that didn't require maintenance. But when the code enforcement for the county got involved for zoning, it couldn't be rezoned to the density that they wanted to put on the smaller tract with the buffer around it. So they couldn't work out the deal. The county was not interested in that. So there are developers that are very interested in, that's a cost savings to them in the long run. They can put all their manpower in one smaller area. They can have the same amount of income from that project, but then they get to also say, hey, look, we built this buffer, we protected this land. Now it's starting to get the government entities involved and getting them to understand that that's a powerful thing that we can do to help their communities going forward. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What can we do locally to help with biodiversity?
What can you help to do locally with biodiversity? I saw some flyers over there. My boss tells me I'm obsessed with invasive species. He joked one time, or somebody, maybe it was one of our board members, they climbed in my truck and they were like, you have a truck of death. Anything to kill an invasive species, I probably have it in my truck. But to me, that's one of the key things going forward. And then leaving buffers. The state mandates a 20-foot buffer on most streams, or 25-foot buffer, 50-foot on trout streams. So around here, almost all of our streams qualify as trout streams. So you're supposed to leave those buffers. Leaving an extra 20 feet, leaving an extra 50 feet is well rewarded to the environment if you leave those buffers alone. And then the other thing is that we have to get natural processes back working again. So prescribed fires are huge right now. It's a scary thing to talk about because we see all the bad things on it. But when we talk about it environmentally, even here in the mountains, we should be having, once a decade, once every 8-year fires. You guys have probably never seen a fire here in the mountains, have you? No. and people have a lot of the same reactions when I bring those things up. They're hard things to do, they're expensive things to do, and somewhat dangerous if you don't know what you're doing and you do it incorrectly. But we're seeing the impacts on the properties where I've been allowed in the last year and a half to aggressively go after invasive species and alter habitat at the same time. Not everything can be a 300-year-old forest, and it doesn't need to be. We're actually losing species because we don't have 5-year-old forest, or we don't have 30-year-old forest. So we have to have some level of disturbance, and we have to have some level of keeping it safe at the same time. And so finding a wise management of that and keeping the invasives out has been huge for us. Yes, sir.
Is that because of the underbrush? You want to keep that under control so you don't have these big forest fires that just get out of control because you have such a
There is that risk, but not so much here in the Southeast. No. We're too wet here in the Southeast to really get a lot of those unless we're in drought. Not to say that we can't, excuse me. But the environment has to have some level of disturbance because there are organisms who are adapted to that disturbance, and they're equally as important as those that are adapted to not be disturbed. And so you need those places that you allow to be disturbed, and you need places that you allow to be relatively minimally disturbed. But everything's adapted to some level of disturbance. But that's what I see the biggest danger for, particularly on our parks and on our preserves. They haven't been disturbed or they've been completely clear-cut, destroyed, and now you have to reintroduce that disturbance to keep the process going to get them to the endpoint. So, for instance, we just planted 200,000 longleaf pine trees in South Georgia this year on a couple of different properties. And those projects were put on places where one was an old field that had been allowed to start growing up, but there were actually longleaf pines there, and the other was down near Callaway Gardens in the city of Hamilton. And just before it was donated to us, the developer landholder graciously clear-cut it, like the 3 days before the transaction took place, and didn't tell us. So we were left with literally 230 acres of clear-cut land, and it's on Pine Mountain, and there are massive longleaf pine trees there. So we said, well, let's make this back into the longleaf mixed hardwood pine, longleaf pine forest it should be. So the first step in that is, well, it's been 7 years. There's nowhere to plant the longleaf pines. We have to go back in and clear it again. And so that was our first step, was to completely rub it down to nothing and then start from there. But now that I'm here and we have policies in place, we will control that forest growth and development through the coming decades. But it's kind of nice to know that some of those trees may be around in 600-800 years. Other people might see the way that it hopefully should have been. So a lot of my work is walk into places where it looks like a nuclear bomb blast happened and say, how do we start? Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
So it wasn't planned, but some of these final comments really lead well into next month's presentation. So we want to continue to talk about habitat and our local habitat. Please come next month. Thank you, Keith. Wonderful presentation. We really appreciate you. Yeah, that's great.